Each film could be talked about for hours, but there's one film that came out 11 years after the release of The Godfather that we have to talk about. Pacino was in West Hollywood in the midst of shooting and Justice for All when he found himself walking down Sunset Boulevard one night with a group of friends he had been making the film with. It's here that he would walk past the Tiffany Theatre, a cinema that showed old movies. Pacino notes here that on the marquee, in all capital letters, was the word Scarface. This was, in fact, the original Scarface, the first released in 1932, a film that featured Paul Muni as Tony Camonte. Pacino knew of the film. He knew it was a classic, but he had never seen it before. So he led his group of friends to go in and watch it right there and then. Pacino notes the film in his book as being an amazing piece of filmmaking by one of the greatest directors who ever lived, Howard Hawks. It's a film that acts as a commentary on the excesses and failings of the Depression era. But it was the lead actor, Paul Muni's performance as Tony Camonte, that really struck Pacino. As he notes, I was no longer a kid sitting by my mother's side in an old movie palace in the South Bronx. I was a grown man, a successful actor. I was inspired by Muni. I wanted to imitate him. I wanted to be him. I said to myself, I think I can do Scarface. I think we can remake this. And although he was no longer the kid that sat next to his mother, he was once again going to do what he did when he was a kid. Watch a performance at the cinema, become obsessed by it, and then want to reenact it. Only now he'll be doing it in a production that will create the iconic 1983 film of the same name, Scarface. Pacino immediately took the idea to his manager and producer, Martin Bregman, who took Pacino's idea very seriously and immediately set about making a deal with Universal for the rights to remake the film and began assembling the talent who would make it come to life. Bregman originally brought in Sidney Lumet to direct the film, the same man who had previously directed Serpico and Dog Day Afternoon. And as for the writer, Bregman hired David Rabe, who wrote a script that was not too dissimilar from the original, but in Bregman's view, didn't quite work, so he was soon replaced. As an experienced and proven director, Sidney Lumet insisted that the film be grounded and realistic and full of themes of social consciousness, just like that of his previous films, but keen to do something that hadn't been seen before, and knowing that Lumet wouldn't probably budge from his vision, Bregman then had Lumet also replaced. So who was going to be this new writer and new director to replace these people who he had previously relied on? Well, to write the film, Bregman was inspired in choosing Oliver Stone, who would later make classics like Wall Street, Platoon, JFK, Natural Born Killers, and would even work again with Pacino on Any Given Sunday. And to direct the film, Bregman got Brian De Palma, who himself would later direct the first Mission Impossible film and would work again with Pacino himself too on Carlito's Way. Palma added a refreshing take to the idea of the film that he wanted it to have an operatic style, for it to be colourful and wildly entertaining. This was music to Bregman's ears. And what Oliver Stone brought to the table was his excitement for the political aspect the film could have. And whilst Lumet, who was the original director, should really be credited for supplying the excellent idea that the new Scarface would be set during the Mariel boat lift, and that the main character of Tony Montana would be one of the thousands of Cuban refugees who came to America, it was Stone who added the details, who would tell Pacino stories of being picked up by real criminals and drug dealers he had met as he went deep in researching the script. I mean, one such coke dealer supplied him with the quote that almost became the kind of life source from which the film story would constantly pull from, that every day above ground is a good day. And so whilst those guys got to work, Pacino had his own preparations to do. Pacino recounts meeting with the costume, hair, and makeup people to talk about the character of Tony, and he'd wonder, what about the scar? How did he get it? Where does it go? And that's where he had the brilliant idea to have the scar go right through his eyebrow and into his face. That said everything you needed to know about this character. He was chaos. In the book, Pacino notes, with Tony Montana, what you see is what you get. His two-dimensionality is the beauty of him for me. If we wanted to get inside Tony, I didn't have to dig deep. Pacino also hilariously reflects on the energy that he had to have for the character. He says, there's this general belief that I'm a cocaine addict or was one. It may surprise you that I've never touched the stuff. However, I've always had abundant energy. I'm always up. And Tony Montana allowed me to pour that into the character. There was also a certain liberation that he offered me. He saw an advertising slogan on the side of a blimp that said, "The world is yours," and truly believed it. That's what inspired me about him and what I took from him. Once filming began, one day, Pacino came to work knowing he had an important scene to film. It'd be the now famous scene that has Tony Montana unusually wearing a tuxedo, but then very characteristically causing a scene whilst in a drunken state in a very elegant restaurant, all before making a great speech to those around him whilst being thrown out of the place. It's here that he'd say one of the most iconic lines in that feature film.
So say good night to the bad guy. Go on. The last time you're going to see a bad guy like this again, let me tell you.
It's truly an iconic scene, and yet we almost got a very different version of it. Because when Pacino walked into his dressing room that day, he was not greeted with his tuxedo, but with his Hawaiian shirts and white suits that he'd been wearing in his other scenes. Pacino, of course, asked what was he supposed to wear that day, to which he was told he would be wearing his usual Tony Montana look, because the scene had now been moved to the nightclub that catered to Tony and the other gang members, the same spot that they always go to. As it turned out, this was a budget decision. Allegedly, Brian De Palma had been shooting over budget, and so as a result, Bregman had decided to cut the dining location in order to save some money. But to Pacino, the usual nightclub did not make sense for this scene. Sure, they'd save money by filming in a location they were already using a lot, but there's no contrast, something that the scene required to make impact. I mean, we're talking about Tony Montana shouting at the higher class that would highlight this really interesting paradox that despite him amassing wealth, he was not really part of the elite that he now pretended to be. That whilst he may have ascended his financial position, he could never ascend class, which would make for very interesting commentary. But in the nightclub, there would be no such resonance. So Pacino, as he puts it, made a stand. He writes in the book, "I had Bregman and Brian in my dressing room, both of whom understandably concerned about the money. And with all due respect to them, I said, you cannot do this. This is not what Oliver wrote. It's even in the stage directions. He had to be in his formal clothes. This is not how the scene was meant to be done. It will lose its meaning." I think I spoke for close to 45 minutes. By the time I was finished, they both looked at me and said, "We're all in trouble now." And I said, "I'm always in trouble, guys. Whether I do this or I don't, I'm in trouble. But what are we supposed to do?" They were smart. They agreed that the scene had to be done at the restaurant. The scene would add an additional $200,000 to the budget, something that might have hurt at the time, but would have mattered far less, despite the film not immediately making a commercial success, admittedly. But as years went on, the film went on to have a tremendous impact, both culturally, but also financially, as it would continue to make money as VHS sales boomed, and then once again, as DVD became popularized. And obviously, I was one of those customers. But I love this story as it teaches an important lesson about being true to your art, no matter the cost. I saw a recent acceptance speech at the Gotham Film Awards by Denis Villeneuve, who beautifully mentioned that the thing he was most proud of in his career thus far was being able to protect his flame, that it was to keep his independent spirit and to not compromise.